The Homeland Security shutdown is delaying key public meetings about forthcoming cyber incident reporting regulations. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency had planned on holding the meetings this month, but much of CISA's operations have been curtailed by the shutdown. For more, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me. Justin, thanks for being here.
Good to be here, Terry.
All right, how is the partial government shutdown impacting CISA's operations and their rollout of these regulations?
Well, only 1/3 of CISA's staff is working through the shutdown and working unpaid through the shutdown. And those are the folks who kind of keep the lights on at CISA in their mission to defend federal government networks, to support critical infrastructure. And so the folks who are writing things like policy and rules are not working at all. And that includes the people who are working on the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act rule, or CIRCIA, as it's known by its acronym. This was a law that passed 4 years ago now. CISA released a proposed rule back in 2024, and then when the Trump administration came in, they delayed some things and kind of wanted to take their own look at it. But they were moving forward with a series of town halls that they had planned for this month and into early April, and then there was a plan to issue the final rule as soon as May of this year. But in a notice posted on its website just earlier this week, CISA said it won't be able to hold those planned town halls because of the lapse in appropriations, and CISA says it's likely that the final rule will be delayed as well.
When do you expect CISA to reschedule the meetings?
CISA says it will issue an updated notice with a revised town hall schedule once the lapse in appropriation ends. So it's anyone's guess at this point as to when Congress comes up with a deal on the shutdown, but there will be these town halls at some point. But again, we don't really know how this is going to shift the schedule on the final rule. And that's a big question for everyone out there because, again, this is a law that passed 4 years ago. It's a pretty important rule for cybersecurity, but it's also a pretty big and impactful rule when you look at all sorts of sectors of the economy.
I know you keep your finger on the pulse of these issues pretty tightly. So if they had the town hall, what was some of the specific feedback you would have expected CISA to receive?
Yeah, fortunately, we had kind of a preview of that in the comments that were submitted about CISA's proposed rule from 2 years ago. And that was a really lengthy document laying out the ins and outs of this regulation. A lot of folks from across the different 16 critical infrastructure sectors that are affected by this rule highlighted some common issues. One of those was the scope of entities, the number of entities that would be captured under the proposed rule. The incident reporting rules, as they're written, would have applied to an estimated 300,000 companies and organizations across the United States. So just a very broad incident reporting mandate. And that's because there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors. They range from healthcare and, chemicals to wastewater and water and electric utilities. And there's just a lot of different things that are considered critical. But CISA is trying to kind of strike a balance here between what is really critical and who might be overburdened by some of these reporting requirements. I spoke with Caleb Skeeth. He's a partner at the law firm Covington, who's been tracking this issue pretty closely as well.
Part of the reasoning and thinking for getting this information to CISA through a incident reporting requirement is to give CISA a certain degree of visibility across the threat ecosystem. So in that regard, it's understandable there might be an interest in going fairly broad, but that's a bit of a double-edged sword in certain respects, because if you go too broad, you might end up with more information than you can readily process or absorb.
That's a really interesting take, especially as we're hearing so much about the potential for cyber threats. It does feel like CISA would want to have as much information as they could get.
Yeah, and it also leads to questions about CISA's ability internally, as Caleb Skeeth kind of alluded to there, about their ability to process all of this information. When you think about 300,000 organizations needing to potentially report cyber incidents to CISA within 72 hours, that's a lot of information flying around at kind of warp speed, and how CISA can pick out what's really relevant to them and what might not be is a critical issue as well.
It might be a great place to deploy AI, but separate from that, have there been other criticisms of the proposed rule that have surfaced so far?
There have been a lot, and it depends on the sector that you're coming from in some cases. But one of the other common criticisms is how CISA is defining a substantial cyber incident that must be reported to the cyber agency versus something that just might not be that big of a deal that obviously, as we were talking about, CISA doesn't want to get too much information if it's not really that relevant. CISA's proposed rule defines a substantial cyber incident as an occurrence that jeopardizes the integrity, confidentiality, or availability of information on an information system, or jeopardizes the system itself. And that's pretty broad and makes sense in some degree, but organizations like the American Hospital Association have said it's relatively vague, and CISA hasn't given any quantifiable or specific examples of what a substantial cyber incident might be or what a substantial loss of, integrity or confidentiality might mean under this reporting rule. And so that's something else that CISA was probably going to hear about at these town halls. And in its Federal Register notice, CISA listed some of these issues that came up in comments, things like the scope of entities that are covered and the definition of the proposed rule as issues they wanted to hear more about during these meetings.
Well, absent to anybody with a good crystal ball reading of when this partial shutdown might be over and this rule might move forward, what else might impact the finalization of the incident reporting rule?
Well, CISA is in charge of writing these regulations, but of course they have to go up through the White House, Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs to be finalized. And then there's the new National Cyber Strategy that just came out in the past week. And that specifically talks about promoting common sense regulation, in the strategy's words. The Office of the National Cyber Director is involved in that strategy, and you could certainly expect that office and National Cyber Director Sean Cairncross to have some opinions and offer some feedback, maybe informally, on what exactly this CISA rule should look like, because they have an interest now in kind of driving this strategy, which includes regulations and making sure that things are streamlined. So I would expect that, there's going to be some additional wrangling up at the White House beyond what CISA finalizes in this rule.
But it sounds like in the short run, folks can just sit tight and wait.
I think so. I think folks are watching this very, very closely, but for now, these rules are still in the proposed stage, and they are not final quite yet.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for the story.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com.